Less, I still have this huge faith that if you explain things properly and you've got genuine evidence, some facts you can put in front of people, things that the Times and the Daily Mail and the BBC can put in front of people and make the case, then people actually get it really fast. People want to be sustainable. You've only got to look at the way that we've all changed our own habits just in the course of the last few years in recycling. If you asked people 15 years ago, do you recycle your rubbish? Most of them would have thought you were a bit of a flake. Now it's absolutely normal. People want to do this, but you've got to make the case for us all. We're not stupid, but we do need facts.
Indeed, and I think that cultural connection between these ecological subjects and how that reflects back into politics is really quite crucial. And again, hopefully this is one of the things that the book will contribute to, is a wider understanding and awareness of these economic values in a way which will enable politicians to start moving into a different space and talking differently about these things. And it's interesting actually to note that the British Treasury now has a so-called Natural Capital Committee advising ministers. And over the next few years, if we begin to unpack these numbers and these ideas in ways that can start to translate into ideas that politicians can back, we might see some quite rapid progress. But I think, as I said earlier on, these ideas, they find their own moment, and I think on this subject we've just arrived at it.
But sometimes nature finds its own moment, and not always in a way that's welcome to us. So let's talk about an issue you raised in the book, which affected a lot of parts of the country last year, and that's flooding.
Yes.
And the question of long-term natural defences and whether the alternatives that proposes. Now, if we need to put a lot more resource into long-term prevention of flooding, who do you get to pay? Is this one for the insurance companies? Is it the poor old taxpayer again?
I think it requires a joined-up approach. And if you look at some of the flood events...
that always means what?
Joined-up
approach. I'd like someone to pay my joined-up bills.
So, for example, at the moment we spend something like £3 billion a year on agricultural subsidies in the United Kingdom. Would it not be possible to target those subsidies in ways that help land to absorb water rather than to shed it very quickly? And there's other money being used in the forestry sector. There are incentives to conserve peat bogs. Those are official subsidies that are there already and incentives. You could make the case for some small contribution from the insurance companies too, because it's in their interest to reduce risk and to reduce losses. And if you start to put that kind of funding together, you can see some big opportunities here and in many parts of the world to enhance ecosystems to reduce flood risk by absorbing more water and reducing the runoff after the immediate event. And
you don't just see another sort of wind farms argument looming where we end up with sounds like a very good green idea and quite quickly shades into an argument about what do we actually get back from it, and indeed is it not just yet another subsidy that is handed out to some people.
Well, my point is that the subsidies are already there and it's a question of redirecting them and using them for a more joined up set of outcomes. And so if we can see ways in which landowners can be incentivised to do more than one thing at once, I think that will be in the public interest in the sense of how we get real value for money. And who's going to argue about restoring the health of woodlands and peat bogs? I think it's much less controversial than renewable energy. And not only actually do we get the water services, if we enhance our peat bogs, we get carbon capture as well.
It's not controversial so much as the worst case analysis, you can't put a date on it. It's in the future. It may or may not happen. It's a risk. And Ngaire, that does seem to be, that is the problem, isn't it? That so many of these things, not something to say, if you don't do something by next December, something even worse will happen by the following March. How do you get to change mindsets, or can you change mindsets in terms of public policy and decisions that people readily take on consequences earlier?
Well, I think people are constantly looking for the big bullet, the big magic bullet. Let's persuade the whole world to move on climate change now, because there'll be a catastrophe very soon if we don't. And I think actually we've had a run at that, and it doesn't work very well.
You're thinking of things like Kyoto and Copenhagen and these attempts to get all governments to come and sign a piece of paper and go away and do it.
Absolutely, and which has a lot of people then saying, oh no, we'll find a geoengineering solution, catastrophe will be averted, and those making the case for catastrophe start sounding like the sort of Mayans that told us that the world would end, in December. I think what becomes really important, as I alluded to before, is that you get a political process which really engages the local community and has them participating in it, and that politicians don't simply speak the role that politicians play is a really important one, because, as Tony said, on the one hand, they will be faced with companies who would like certain contracts, but on the other, they can be a voice to a community that helps to mobilise a particular community. And you do see it in one New York borough, for example. Instead of building a new, very expensive dam, and there were some companies lining up for that very lucrative contract, a couple of decades ago, instead they, at the taxpayers' expense, they replaced all the toilets in that borough to use far less water. And in so doing, they averted building a large dam with a lot of associated environmental damage. So it's possible. And I actually think that the process that's being used, the ensuring that the local community can come together and inform themselves, ensuring politicians are informing on both sides of the equation.
But you see, this strikes me as an interesting way in which the Green argument is changing, or at least changing for some people. It sounds like you don't have a lot of faith in the idea of going back and doing a Kyoto, Copenhagen, wherever the next great government shebang would be, that you would rather leave these kind of the big set-piece summits behind and go local.
Yeah, the big set-piece summits can help focus attention. They should only be used for those things which absolutely cannot be done at the local level. And what I'm seeing is politicians at local levels and national levels throwing up their hands and saying, well, we can't do anything until there's a global agreement. That's very dangerous, because the global agreement is the hardest of all to get. So you're far better to start at the local and then leave for the global only that which absolutely can't be done anywhere else.
Well, if Tony's book is an attempt to change attitudes to the natural world with an argument about practical benefits, I guess I'm wondering whether purloining the language of finance can move people to protect nature. And another approach, which some people favour, has been dubbed landscape literature, and that's celebrating nature more evocatively. I've just been reading Robert Macfarlane's book on walking the old ways, and writers like Mark Cocker and the poet Kathleen Jamie are also ploughing this furrow. William Fiennes, you wrote The Snow Geese a decade ago when these subjects felt perhaps a bit less fashionable than they do now. What inspired your decision to embed yourself so totally in nature on your odyssey with the geese?
Well, you are right to say that in some ways these things weren't so fashionable in those days. I mean, when I started writing The Snow Geese in around 2000, I didn't really feel I had a lot of British models of writing about the natural world. It's interesting you use the term landscape literature, and often people talk about nature writing, and I've always been a little bit suspicious of those terms. I mean, as Jim Hamilton said, to talk about nature writing is like talking about water swimming, and we are nature too, so what other kind of writing is there? And I think that in a way, even in having those sort of generic labels, it slightly reinforces...
It puts it in a niche, doesn't it?
Well, and
you
it also...
see a library shelf somewhere dustily entitled Nature Writing.
Yeah, exactly. But it also reinforces, in a way, a schism between human beings and the rest of the natural world, which I think is at the root of many of the problems that Tony is addressing. But for me, there were British books like The Peregrine by J.A. Baker, which I was enthralled by, but mostly there was a North American tradition of writing about the natural world, which really came from Henry Thoreau and Melville and Ralph Emerson. And then more recently, I was enthralled by writers like Barry Lopez and Annie Dillard and John Muir and Aldo Leopold and Wendell Berry. There was this incredibly vibrant tradition of American nature writing that was partly to do, I think, with how the essay was thriving as a form in North America. But the actual immediate impulse for writing The Snow Geese was being very ill and spending a lot of time in hospital, which was in a way for me a kind of closing down of experience. And The Snow Geese is the story of somebody having had all of their experience closed down, wanting to go out into the world and sort of gulp it down and register a sense of wonder and beauty and awe. And although I loved those books, they were about, their primary focus was the non-human world, I wanted to pay attention to everything and have the book as full of people talking and people's characteristics as it was of bird behaviour and bat behaviour and other things.